What is poverty? Well, the Oxford Dictionary defines noun as a state of being extremely poor. Well, duh. Anyone could come up with that. Poverty is much more complicated than this. However, we promise that we'll help break it down so that you'll have a much more comprehensive and empathetic understanding of defining and measuring poverty.
We feel our definition of poverty better captures its complexity. We define poverty as not only the experience of having inadequate economic resources, but also as the state of having central capabilities below a given threshold, causing difficulties in achieving the functionings necessary to flourish in society. While society currently views poverty as the condition of living with an income below a national poverty line, poverty varies between communities and thus warrants a more comprehensive measurement, a combination of the SPM and other qualitative and quantitative measurements. Among the countless methods individuals have discovered to describe and define poverty, we feel the capabilities approach, a concept first expressed by economist and philosopher Amartya, most comprehensively encapsulates what we should discuss when defining poverty.
In Amartya Sen's book, The Quality of Life, which he wrote alongside Martha Nussbaum, philosopher and professor at the University of Chicago, Sen defines capabilities as a person's ability to achieve various valuable functionings as a part of living. In Amartya Sen's book, The Quality of Life, which he wrote alongside Martha Nussbaum, philosopher and professor at the
Basically, one's capabilities are the actual options and opportunities a person possesses. Let's break it down a little more, though.
In her book, Creating Capabilities, Nussbaum asserts that in order for an individual to pursue a dignified and minimally flourishing life, a political order must secure to all citizens at least a threshold level of 10 central capabilities.
One might ask whether those who possess sufficient economic resources but seemingly lack certain capabilities can be considered poor. Think about it like this. A wealthy person with chronic back pain has the monetary resources to help himself, and thus this person would not be categorized as poor.
Similarly, in his work, Poverty and Affluence, Sen illustrates two different people, both starving, but one because he or she is fasting for religious purposes, and the other because he or she does not have the economic means and thus the true capability to eat. As a society, we should primarily focus on those whose economic deficiencies coincide with diminished capabilities.
Of course, while a general capabilities threshold trend exists among individuals, households, communities, and cultures, variances do exist among these entities. Thus, these entities should have the right to access the central capabilities to the extent that pleases their given thresholds and allows them to attain the highest level of functionings that they can achieve.
For example, Nussbaum says that being able to live to the end of a human life of normal length and not dying prematurely are essential capabilities that a life of human dignity require. However, not all people possess this opportunity, perhaps because of an incurable illness or something of that nature.
Similarly, differences in culture cause differences in central capability threshold levels. For example, higher education might not be as valued in other cultures as it is in the United States. Therefore, the threshold level of Nussbaum's senses, imagination, and thought capability would be different in that culture. Let's recap. If capabilities are the opportunities an individual is given, what are functionings?
By functionings, we are referring to what Sen calls the doings and beings of an individual or what that individual has achieved given his or her capability set. An example of functionings would be attaining good health, being properly clothed, housed, and fed.
Central capabilities, economic resources, and the functionings they create have a cyclical relationship. An individual, household, or community cannot attain the necessary economic resources without meeting their central capability thresholds. And without attaining those resources, they cannot attain the functionings necessary to live with dignity and without social exclusion. So wait, what's social exclusion?
Well, imagine Sally. Because Sally comes from a low-income family, she cannot afford to purchase athletic shoes to play basketball with her friends. So, because of her economic state, she is excluded from the activities available to most people in society.
So, we define poverty as having diminished economic resources resulting in diminished capabilities, leading to social exclusion.
Defining poverty is a feat in and of itself. We also need to figure out how to properly measure poverty, because the whole point in finding and measuring it is so we can help those who face it. Defining poverty.
Currently, poverty is measured using the official poverty measurement, an impersonal measurement that provides a poverty line, but is outdated. In his work, Poverty in America, John Iceland says that the existing measure has lost some meaning over time.
We feel that a better way to measure poverty is to use a measure called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, as well as discursive measurements. But first, let's talk about why the OPM isn't working so well for Americans.
As times have changed, the OPM has not adapted to changes in American lifestyles. Aside from its outdated nature, here are some of the most prominent issues with our current method of measuring poverty. 1. It only takes into account related individuals in a household. For example, foster children are not included in the measurement. Number 2. The poverty income threshold is 3 times the minimum food diet in 1963, according to Kathleen Short. According to Iceland, this equation was designed to not take into account expenses from eating out or for eating a diverse and healthy diet. The other problem with this is that the food prices have dropped since 1963, so the equation should be invalid. Number 3, it does not take into account the different costs of living in different states. And number 4, it does not take into account in-kind benefits such as SNAP, WIC, and Medicaid. Thus, according to the OPM, individuals receiving substantial aid from these benefits are still facing poverty, even if their lives and well-being have improved.
The Supplemental Poverty Measure, which we prefer to use as a measurement for poverty, takes into account in-kind benefits such as SNAP, WIC, Medicaid, as well as utility assistance programs, work-related expenses, and out-of-pocket medical expenses. The SPM also takes into account geographic location because $1,000 in New York does not get you nearly as far as $1,000 in rural Alabama. One of the biggest upsides to using the SPM over the OPM is that instead of using food times 3 to determine a poverty line, it uses the 33rd percentile of overall spending on food, shelter, clothing, and utilities, and then multiplies it by 1.2. This is a better approach to measure poverty because it takes into account what somebody needs to meet their basic needs, plus extra for pleasure spending.
While the SPM provides a more encompassing measurement than the OPM, the well-being of a community cannot always be quantified. So, applying Nussbaum's central capabilities to communities as a whole, a qualitative style of measurement, combined with some quantitative data, is more beneficial.
For example, a community, quote, in which wealth and income are both reasonably high and fairly equally distributed, end quote, does not necessarily equate to a society that possesses religious freedom, bodily health resources, and is free of marginalized groups. Nussbaum provides a historical example citing that, quote, societies often contain groups that are reasonably wealthy but socially excluded, i.e. Jews in the 18th century and 19th century, gays and lesbians in the 20th century of the United States, end quote.
While these marginalized individuals may have possessed an adequate level of income and wealth, the marginalization they faced hindered their freedoms, their well-being, and their chances of achievement.
Nussbaum challenges that the real question one should ask is, what are people actually able to do and be? What real opportunities has society given them? Nussbaum challenge.
For example, one could ask, do the individuals in demographic A have an equal educational opportunity? So take demographic A and say that it has a lower high school graduation rate than demographic B. One can then question the quality of demographic A schools, not only taking grades and test scores into account, but also considering the quality of its resources. Discursive measurements stem from numerical measurements. So, it's the combination of these two forms of analysis that provide the full picture of the capabilities of a community that is able to provide for its citizens.
You've probably faced a lot of new knowledge throughout this presentation, so let's try to wrap everything together. An individual is facing poverty when he or she lacks the necessary economic resources and fails to meet his or her central capability thresholds, which vary from community to community and culture to culture. These deficiencies lead to a life of social exclusion. In turn, one should measure poverty using a combination of the SPM and discursive measurements, allowing us to analyze the true well-being of individuals and communities. One might say that all these measurements and definitions suggest a much more difficult, time-intensive method of looking at poverty. However, if our reasons for studying poverty are because we care about the well-being, freedoms, and dignity of human beings, we should take the measures necessary to truly understand the struggles they undergo. Taking shortcuts will not lead to progress.